Okay, thank you all very much for joining us for our final keynote of SRF 2022. I am delighted to be introducing Reverend Dr. Peter Phillips, who is from the Codec Research Centre, which is the Centre for Digital Theology. With a PhD in John's Gospel and many years' experience teaching and researching the New Testament, Pete now explores the interface between all things digital and theological. So maybe we'll have to challenge about that. How all things. During his time at Codec, Pete has pioneered new ways of exploring theology among the digital humanities and also developed the world's first MA in Digital Theology, hosted with Cranmer's Hall's Institute Suite.
Nice versions.
Sorry?
Nice versions.
Nice versions of MA programs. Pete loves playing with tech, hacking new data, developing new opportunities for research. A lot of Pete's work takes him outside of Durham, working with the Church of England's digital team, exploring new funding opportunities and speaking at major international conferences. So really pleased to welcome you, Pete, and over to you.
Cheers. Nice to see you all. Thank you very much for staying on. Exploring today something about digital theology, but also this concept of metaphysics of information, which we've heard so much about. That's an old bio. I need to change it. So now I'm mostly based at Spurgeon's College, half-time, and working with the Global Network for Digital Theology and the MA in Digital Theology we have there, and so on. A kind of victim of the COVID, as we had to move away from Durham and move south to London. And now starting up PhD programs and a DMin in the States, and this global network of about 200 scholars around the world looking at digital theology. In this paper, I'd like to offer a brief introduction to digital theology as a precursor to some more critical thinking about a possible metaphysics of information. Although I wish I'd given this paper on Thursday, because of the wealth of papers since has made me a little unsure of my own contribution to the galaxy of scholarship on display. You'll get some glimpses of other papers, I'm sure, along the way, I hope. And I rewrote some parts of it last night simply to bring some of those aspects in. The conversations I've had with many people here have kind of opened my own thinking about some of these areas. Anyway, here goes, and then we can go home. As the introduction to the forthcoming Oxford Handbook on Digital Theology will put it, digital theology is fundamentally faith-seeking understanding in a digital age. Although perhaps I want to mess around with that a bit, the kind of hack mentality that was mentioned in that bio. Is it faith-seeking understanding of digitality? Is it faith-seeking data? Faith-seeking a grasp of the new world of digitality? Faith seeking to understand why our devices have become so much part and parcel of a new globally networked society, globally networked culture? Or faith-seeking understanding of those left behind, those excluded, those cancelled from this culture. Faith-seeking understanding of the way these products or devices act as domestic extensions of the military-industrial complex, as Philip Butler would surely put it. And as we saw in yesterday's keynote from Matthew and Rachel. Digital theology is a theological grappling with conditions increasingly defined by the ubiquitous and sometimes dangerous applications of digital technology. As such, digital theology could be branded as contextual theology, the context being digitality, or perhaps more positively, as constructive theology, trying to work out how we develop a theology within a new expression of society, in its attempt to bring Christian concepts into conversation with digital culture. But is digital the context, or does the ubiquity of digital, the change which digital is forcing on us, in turn forcing us to construct a new theology, a new metaphysics? And I think we've seen a lot of that in the conversations that we've had here at this meeting of SRF. Whilst digital religion seeks to survey how religion is expressed in the digital, digital theology is also interested in where God is in all of this. Not just exploring the social phenomenon when religion meets new media, Heidi Campbell's cracking book, but seeking understanding of digitality's impact on us as human beings, as image bearers, as citizens of heaven. Or as the recent smartphone report would have it, the global smartphone report from UCL, the QR code will allow you to download that report straight to your devices and apps and what have you, and I don't take any data off through the use of the QR code. Honest. You believe me, don't you? I don't. Their argument is that our home is now the phone itself. Yeah? Our home is now the phone itself. What does that mean? But digital theology isn't just obsessed with human management and digitality and what it's doing to us. We're also engaged in how God and digitality coexist. What are the implications for what we believe about God, for what we know of God, and what we say about God? I've got to multitask here. I can't do that. Of course, we saw all of that in the pandemic church. The church enthusiastically, from my point of view, negatively if you read the Church Times, embraced digitality when church buildings were closed. And it's amazing that the COVID came when it did, because we had digitality to fall back onto. What if we had had the COVID epidemic 20 years ago? We've had much more fighting around whether churches should have stayed open or whether they should have closed in the first place. But instead we had the opportunity to go digital and to actually include lots more people in the church, the enterprise of the church. The data from the States is that 38% of people attended online church in some way during the lockdown. From the United States, from the UK, our research with alongside Savanta Comres, their online panel suggested 25% of people were saying that they attended online worship in some way or other. Now, those figures seem huge, but that's what the internet panels are coming back to us, and we need to look at why they do feel so huge to us. We saw live stream services come on first of all, with this idea of replicating BBC kind of thing, and a kind of hyper-professionalization of everything. The Methodist Church, for example, chose 3 highly successful, highly engaged, and gave them more money to produce a live stream version. So Swanbank in Stoke-on-Trent, and then 2 London churches, Wesley's Chapel in the City, and a Methodist Central Hall opposite Parliament. The Church of England its own virtual services. Yep, this kind of sense of kind of deceitic sense that this is a virtual thing rather than a real service because it's online, which kind of feeds the whole conversation about whether digital is actually a virtualization, a gnosticization of faith, which of course is blatantly and utterly stupid. We then saw the development of Zoom churches as we went through. We saw the shift towards spiritual communion in the first bit. I'll come back to Zoom church in a bit. Where the Eucharist was celebrated first in empty churches and then often at kitchen tables, but only with the officiating priest who received the elements and perhaps old tech doesn't turn over properly, and perhaps her partner if he was present. Whilst the congregation read out a Cranmer-based prayer celebrating the fact that God could pass on the blessing without us actually consuming the bread and wine. Which is a really interesting thing for a church to do, because you're then saying you'd never need to come to communion again. Just do this prayer. And surprisingly, we find that as people come back beyond the initial pandemic, it's an ongoing pandemic, everybody, still hundreds of people dying. We now find that 1/3 of people have returned, 1/3 have lost the habit, and 1/3 are still watching online. Okay? So it's really funny that doing that prayer could have been one of the major things that has lost the habit of church going in the UK, which is very, very interesting. Others of us, jumped instead into full online communion. I remember having the phone call from my chairman of district up in Darlington, I was at Durham at the time, saying, Pete, just watch it, don't do communion online, we're watching you. Okay? So the Methodist Church stamping down very heavily and saying, you are a test case. If you do online communion, you will be charged, and you will be evicted from the Methodist Church, or whatever, defrocked. And I know loads of people in the Church of England who have now got blue letters in their files because they engage in online communion. In the Methodist Church, we won the battle. We fought the battle during lockdown, and at the end of, in the summer 2021, the Methodist Church passed a resolution that we should have a 3-year experiment about online communion. So we fell into line with the Baptist Church, the URC, International Methodism, and so on, in saying yes, we can do online communion as long as it's synchronous, and as long as there's a whole load of things. But that synchronicity is really interesting because you can never have synchronicity. You know, if you're scientific at all, you know that synchronicity is impossible in an online network. But instead you've got to have synchronicity. So we're taking that as kind of assumed synchronicity. Yeah, that the priest must be able, or the minister must be able to see their congregation and vice versa. Yeah. So we won that, but bread and wine, proximal to the celebrant, was consecrated. Sorry, I missed a bit here. Others jumped instead of a full-on communion, arguing that since God and not the priest consecrates bread and wine, God does the consecration. Yeah, unless you're massively Catholic, in which you think that as a priest you are in persona Christi, therefore the breaking of the bread goes back to the Last Supper, and you are now as Christ standing there breaking bread and wine. I have some sympathy with that, but not many people. There's some people in that area and some aren't. But if God is the one who consecrates, and I suppose if Jesus is doing the consecrating, it's still God, then distance and separation could not be an issue for God. Yeah? That's the idea for those of us who believe in online communion, that God's the one doing the consecrating. It's not magic hands of the priest. Yeah? And therefore God is omnipresent and can be present in different places at different times. Bread and wine proximal to the celebrant was consecrated by God, just as bread and wine proximal to members of the congregation in their separate homes. God was the union, the connector, the quantum connection between those present in each other, to each other online through Zoom or Facebook. Perhaps quantum entanglement entering into online communion there. Where 2 or 3 meet together in God's name, God is there. But that meet together has become a word of anger and confrontation and conflict within the church. Because what do we mean by that? Many opposed to online gatherings, and I've heard that argument here too. Many people are opposed to such online gatherings, and I've heard that argument here too. Some have argued that on-site, so online and on-site are the two terms we're trying to use, because they don't say online or in person. Yeah? Which privileges real things like this as being in person, as though those of you who are on Zoom aren't real people. Yeah? But the people who are engaging on Zoom are as much sat at their computers in full physical form as any of the rest of us. But also it suggests that virtual or in person means that those who are unable to come to our physical buildings because of disability, because of age, because of being housebound, are only virtual people, virtual Christians. Get it? That they're not bona fide people. They're not bona fide Christians because of their impairment of some kind. Really interesting kind of models that here. Some have argued that on-site expressions of church were the only valid form of church, are the only valid form of church. And I think that harks back to a temple theology, which seems to suggest that God could and did manifest his presence only in the right kind of building, only when people were corporeally present in that building, almost as if God was allergic to manifesting his glory through a device. Of course, worship is always mediated through technology, through ritual, through word, and through liturgy. If you don't understand that a church building itself is a form of technology, you don't understand much about technology. If you don't think the liturgy and worship and the various things associated with it are a form of technology, then perhaps there needs to be some rethinking about what we think technology is. While at the same time it was Jesus who told the Samaritan woman that there would come a time when worship would not be geographically limited to Gerizim or Jerusalem. Instead, true worshippers will worship the Father in spirit and in truth, or in the spirit of truth, Hendidas. For these are the kind of worshippers the Father speaks. John 4:21. It's as if worship is not geolocated, but deolocated. a sense that we connect with the divine where we are. I like my slip of the tongue there. I love that slip. Sorry. A more Celtic, a less Western, a more ancient way of devotion. The sense of spiritual is not the same as this kind of one-to-one presence. But this seems not to be enough, even in the post-late pandemic church, where often churches are deserted, where clerics call their people back to the empty pews. This, we are told sternly, is where God's home is. Here is where we meet him, and it usually is him. Of course, there are lots of issues around this, in that it also means that we, the builders of such shrines, become brokers of God. God becomes a brokered God, that we manage people's access to her, to them. Come to our place because this is where God lives. We domesticate God. We put God in a stone zoo and almost sell tickets. But the building has become the mediating technology, and the technology tells us what we believe about God, how we think God wants to be mediated in our current technological milieu, or where we think God wants to be mediated. Simply saying on site is the only valid form of church says something about our understanding of technology as much as it does about our understanding of religion. Yeah, absolutely huge that. I'm happy to talk about it later if you want to. I digress, I admit. I do that. We're here to discuss the metaphysics of data, or rather a metaphysics of information, perhaps. As a mere theologian, and indeed a digital theologian, a hacker theologian perhaps, the title came before the research and didn't get updated soon enough. We need to build towards this, and I will do so. But I think it first needs some more conversation about the importance of the concept of reflexivity and interface within digital theology. Digital theology is concerned, I kind of defend that, with all things digital and with all things theological. It's about consciously, intentionally, proactively bringing a theological perspective into our study of contemporary digitality. So, doing that spiritual engagement within our study of contemporary digitality, always looking at technology and theology side by side and saying, how do these two things relate? What's the web? What's the interconnection between them? Let's not just study the technology and its effects. Let's not then just study theology of God and what have you. Let's see the technology and theology of how they overlap with one another. But also bring a digital perspective into our theology. Our latest, the Global Network conference last June, covering 6 continents, was all about how digital is changing the teaching of theology. Yep. And how it's altering the way that we think through our theology, but also the way we teach it. Perhaps you should go to transhumanism, as we listened to before. Amazing talk this morning. As we heard yesterday and today, there are many different versions of transhumanism, from the medical to the cryogenic to the digital, from creating cyborgized humans, or uploaded humans, or immortal humans. Sometimes the shift is from carbon wetware to silicon hardware. I kind of went from this morning thinking, hey, hold a minute, these people are never virtual because they're still embedded on a hard drive somewhere. You can't upload a brain to nothing. You know, it's being uploaded to hardware that presumably needs some serfs to look after it. Yep, serfs to look after the servers, so that we can liberate those who want to be liberated from physical life, but they're still chained to physicality. Can a human ever be not chained to physicality? One might question. If that's where the technology is at the moment, I'm not sure where the technology would need to go in order to allow that data to live outside of a physical presence. We can't see that kind of technology yet, can we? And of course, sometimes the shift involves uploading our neural networks into a computer chip, which we can insert into a borrowed or cyborg sleeve or skin, as in the Altered Carbon series, if you've seen that. Sometimes it means gene modification or upgraded biology. Although perhaps the blurring, perhaps the blurring of, I should have another thing on it. Perhaps the blurring of cyborgs and humans is the most dangerous of paths in all of this. This is, of course, from Blade Runner 2049, which is, the best film ever. And the whole question is the human a cyborg, which he thinks he is? Yep. Or is the cyborg human? And she's not actually a cyborg, she's just see Phillips? The woman characterized here is a projection. Yeah? So which is the human, which is the cyborg? Because they all don't really know who they are. Or they're trying to work out who they are. Perhaps the blurring of cyborgs and humans is the most dangerous path in all of this, because it's the refusal to accept our limitations as human beings, the assumption that we are just cyborgs in waiting, our brains dying to be uploaded into a computer, that when we are sentient cyborgs, as Blade Runner tells us, this will allow us to be more human than the humans. There's now, almost more human than the humans. The ascent of man is a motif, is so strong in digitality. Transhumanism has its many forms. Kurzweil and Vitamore urge us to slough off the restraints of carbon substrates and wetware. Musk urges us to slough off the earth and head for the stars, to travel across the vast expense of space as refugees from a world we ourselves have destroyed or are destroying. It's almost as though Musk has kind of given up on Earth. And so now he can invest all in carbons and everything in order to destroy this Earth because Mars is our new home. God help us. Others urge us to climb into the freezer until the new life-giving science arrives. Sadly, the freezer probably melt. Even Blade Runner 2049, with its shift from cyborg rights to cyborg ascendancy, even in that, humanity remains a bestial voice of itself, with the violence it pours out on non-human life forms, and especially against women. So all these kind of things have this kind of innate problem within them. But then I've talked about a bestial form of humanity, and so perhaps we need to go back to the Psalms and ask, what is humanity that you are mindful of her? Picture here of the robot from Ex Machina, I think this is ever, yeah? What's the human species that you're mindful of us? What are the descendants of Adam that you care for us? You've made us a little lower than the heavenly beings and crowned us with honour and glory. And did a thought experiment with some students in the Digital Theology MA, wondering what it would be forever to say that, or how about the Dolores escaping from Westworld to kind of query that, or the various people in Blade Runner 2049 to question what it means for humanity. There's this amazing thing, I'm going to track now, but Bill in the Channel 4 episode, Channel 4 series, Humans. Everyone seen Humans? Yeah. So Bill is a synth, a kind of domestic robot, but they've been tinkered with, their code's been tinkered with, and they now feel that they are human, okay? And have sentience and so on. Bill, in one of the early episodes, goes into this room, and they're all being chased, and it looks like an end-of-life moment for him. He kneels down and raises his arm and says, "Dear God, if you exist, save me, and I'll give my life to you for the rest of eternity," or whatever, yeah? It's an amazing sense of what's going on here with this synth. He's a character in a film, so you've got to be very careful of what's going on. What is humanity? That form which God shaped in clay and into which God breathed God's breath, God's ruach. What is humanity, God, that you're mindful of us? And what if, in fact, we are already cyborgs, that we are already transhuman, that we are already post-human? Because indeed, haven't we always been cyborgs? Isn't that the skill of humanity? That we have always been transhuman or post-human, always transitioning from one form of human state to another. Humanity always using extraneous materials to survive in hostile environments. I've come to Birmingham from my home, Maidenhead, and I've put on my jacket because it's so cold in the north. But when I lived in Durham, I was happy to go around in t-shirts, so I must have been acclimatized to it. And am I now a transhuman that I live in the south and I'm so nesh? Sorry, nesh is a northern word, meaning, yeah, nesh. But aren't we always transitioning? The earliest of our creation myths hark back to those very struggles. As Amber Case puts it in her very, very famous YouTube or TED Talk, we are all cyborgs. How much more medical assistance, however much medical assistance is inbuilt with us, as we outsource knowledge to computers, as we converse with quasi-sentient AI, will it simply become more and more the case that we become more aware of our existing posthumanism, our existing transhumanism? And I too pay my respects to Bill Gowland, who I once met at Luton Industrial College. What's the theological ethics of all of this? Or the metaphysical reality of our increased cyborgization? Are we as transhumans, transitioning humans, losing or loosing the image of God? Or are we creating a new image for God which we can fit, a digital identikit God? God the technologist, God the creator, God the initiator of quantum reality. I was amazed in the conversations and kind of engaging with some of Neil Gregerson's work beforehand, in which kind of God changes his identity in a way in exploring information and data and so on. That as we look at quantum theory shifts our perceptions of who God is. That he becomes this all-embracing concept, that he loses some of the manifestations we've experienced over the years. And I suppose in images of the cosmic Christ, Christ too loses something of his identity. Does our progress in transhumanism reflect the image of the technological shape-forming creator God? My word, he's getting at me. This must be the demon that Marius is telling us about. Rocco's Balsas, because he's coming to get me. We are obsessed with creating the concept of improving ourselves while technology degrades the earth. We haven't talked much about this at this conference, though Beth reminded us. We allow the tech industry to proclaim the innocence of the algorithmic machine learning, or mining Bitcoin, or online shopping, whereas in fact the server farms all need building, maintaining, cooling, and together create more carbon emissions than the whole of aviation put together. As Kate Crawford points out in the Atlas of AI, digitality continues to rape the Earth's resources, often the very rarest resources, through the most hazardous forms of mining, often to the detriment of the poorest of the Earth's citizens. So what's our theological response to this? Or indeed to the more depressing issue of the climate emergency or current extinction event? Is it 60% of all flying insects lost in the UK over the last 20 years? In what ways is the military-industrial complex guilty of denying the viability of the planet which God gives us as a gift, as Michael told us earlier on this morning? Of seeing the Genesis mandate as one of raping the earth rather than stewarding our planet and her resources? It's really interesting how we change not only God's image, but our own perspective towards creation, our own stewardship of the world that we've been given. I mentioned this at the AAR's meeting on AI and ethics last year in San Diego. And not San Diego, San Antonio. And it was really interesting how the scientists came back to me and collared me after the conversation and said, but we need the science in order to do the computer predictions of climate change. We need the science to tell us what's going to happen to get us out of this. And while we were having a talk earlier on this thing, I remember my last reading of Simon Morden's sci-fi Flight of Aphrodite, his latest book, where he posits the possibility of the aliens who built the pyramids coming back. He just floats the idea of whether they can come back and save the earth at the last moment. Yeah? In the chapter before this revelation, the Ross ice shelf has finally broken away. Yep. and Earth faces imminent flooding of most of the Western and, the non-Western world has already gone most of it by then. But all the big cities would go as well. Not that I'm counter to science. Please don't kind of get me into the kind of we've got to go back and we've got to escape from science and go back to a kind of off-grid moment. I think we're past off-grid. One of my own central talents in my version of digital theology is that if we are scientists, technologists, we are so because we bear the image of a creator God who in the Trinity brooded over creation, fashioned it with love, informed it into being. Can I say that again? Because I think that for me is absolutely crucial. I want to say it. One of my own central tenets of my version of digital theology is that if we are scientists, technologists, we are so because we bear the image of a God, a creator God, who brooded over creation, fashioned it with love, and informed it into being. The Logos has reason and creativity as story and as word, as the divine conversation, divine information, incarnated as a carpenter's son, a tradesman, a builder, a creator of tools. However the world came into being, through Darwinian evolution, cosmic, divine, or periodic creation, we are told again and again in our sacred text that God was involved, intimately involved, that God initiated and preceded that event, that God maintains his constant acts of creation for eternity. It's not really a case of us trying to fit God into the gaps, but rather to see God's overarching role in all that is. It's not that God pressed the button at the Big Bang. It's not that God wrote the equations of existence and went back to bed. It's not that God wrote the algorithm. God is the very ground of being. God, both that which initiates quantum events, initiates difference, and God which informs the difference into being, and God which forms being, informs being with love. The God which forms being, informs being with love. Straight from Neil Gregerson's 2013 article. In my own field of Bible then, when we look at the history of the text or how we might read and engage with the Bible in a digital age, it isn't just that we use algorithms to find meanings, to isolate patterns and intertextualities. We explore how people use social media to express their own understanding of the text. The Bible itself, as Michael Hemingway has put it, becomes an interface where knowledge and meaning is forged, a space for meaning making, a place where divine creativity burns. But such creativity needs the observer, it needs the reader. The interaction, as in postmodern reader response theory, where meaning is not resident in the text, where we kind of find it, unearth it, but in the reading process itself. That's what my PhD was all about in John's Gospel. Sign, signified, and meaning. But rather than a reader reading a passive text, as Kierkegaard argued, the text itself is alive, a place of encounter between us and the divine, God addressing us. In Augustine's experience, a text which cries out, "Tolle lege, pick me up." It's quick and powerful and sharper than a two-edged sword, says Hebrews. As a place of interface between God's word, God's logos, spoken word and living word and creative word, and the one engaging, the Bible becomes part of the process of God informing, or God's formation or information of being. This interface raises the potential of both sides of the interface being charged with the interaction, a God affected by God's own creativity. The Word speaking to God, just as John 1 says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was addressing the divine, in conversation with divine, in relationship with divine. I'll show you the Greek if you want me to afterwards. I'm really happy to. Pros ton theon, this kind of the shift in the pros, it doesn't work in Greek. It shouldn't be there. But it's there, following a verb of being rather than a verb of speaking, as though the verb of being becomes a verb of speaking itself. Huge. Where am I? Stop it, please. In fact, such concepts of God's word as a reflexive place of meaning. opens up the possibility that the Bible is not so much that the text is itself a sentient being, becomes properly, that's the most important part. The written form of the Logos of God is a form of properly sentient technology. Yes, I'm saying that the Bible itself, in the reading process, we actually find a properly sentient piece of technology. Not so much the text itself as a sentient being, but the interface of Logos and human agent certainly involves the interaction, meaning and meaning-making between two forms of sentience, the divine Logos and the human being. Would it be possible to see this as analogous to sentient technology? Hemingway, of course, wants to push us even further in a different direction and argues that machines too can engage in such an interface and perhaps even create new discourses where new information is developed. So where might we go with a theology, a metaphysics of information? I didn't realise Niels was going to be here, I wrote this paper before I looked at the programme, and I based a lot of what I want to say on his article in 2013. And then here's the man in person, saying much the same thing. So I didn't go to the pub last night, I rewrote this section. In that article, God, Information and Complexity, Niels starts out with the concept of God as infinite. Not as God contained as a discrete entity, a God who sits in heaven, Yahweh, or whoever you think God might be called, but God as that which contains everything within God's self. So God is all-encompassing. God's self is everything, and we dwell within God from the beginning. Huge possibilities of Maximus and others who said similar things in Bonaventure. God is therefore the interface which holds within God's self all that is and was and will be, including all creatures, and indeed incorporates the experiences of such creatures into divine life. God who both initiates quantum creativity, who engages and embraces the life in the form that it embraces the life it brings forth. A God who encompasses all. And for his version of metaphysics, Gregerson needs less God. But it's possible to see a God who encompasses all to be also manifested in that which is created. So talking the other day about the Logos present in God's self, even though through the Logos perhaps the energy of God shaping and forming creation, but also the Logos as God's information, life's DNA, the creative word echoing through the universe. But then the Word which became flesh, incarnate in humanity, enabling humanity to experience God in the flesh, or God with clay, as Gregerson put it, Niels put it. To educate both God and humanity through a shared concept of love. To educate both God, self, and humanity through a shared concept of love. This proper reflexivity of experience, kind of Pannenberg, kind of process theology, of community, of Trinity. A Logos which might be information itself, but if it became flesh, an information which changes shape, changes status, goes through an energy shift itself. But how can that be? A Logos asarkos, as Jensen pointed out, before becoming ensarkos. A sarx which both knew to both life and death. A sarx brought to new life after death, and raised to the presence of God, wounded still, and yet changing heaven in his presence, changing God's self in the presence of materiality. What does it mean if information changes? What does it mean if information goes through different states? What does it mean if information dies and can come back to life? If Jesus is the Logos, there's a lot more to think about, as Bill Gowland's always been telling us, about who the cosmic Christ might be, what the cosmic Christ might be. And we need to pull information into that. As we all heard, for Professor Gregerson, logos is where information comes in. Logos is information which entails difference. Logos entails form and relational structure, as God is a community of love with a continuous identity and through temporal flux. And God is information which entails semantic reference and communication. A God self which speaks to us, speaks to his creation, informs his creation, but also receives that as well. I've got a section on those three, but you've all heard it from Neil much better than I have. So perhaps time to shift on a little bit more. This is why I really did need to change that title from Metaphysics of Data to Metaphysics of Information. Data is raw and unorganized, but information might be seen as being processed, organized data, information that is able to direct processes of change, making use of the data it has organized. Information is a living thing, something that has agency of itself, causality of itself. Or is information simply resting back on godness? There's arguments that we heard about Maximus and the Energai and so on, and this issue at Mount Athos of whether they were really experiencing God or were they experiencing the Energeia. Kind of seems to be something of the same kind of argument going on here about whether information can change, or is information separate from God, or is God part of that? Or of course it's all embraced in. So you have a kind of monad God rather than a Trinitarian God. That God, Christ has to be contained within God, just as energy and information and what have you has to be contained within God, and quantum and so on. What are we doing here about the God that we understand, and have we quite got it right yet? Is the relationship between God, what's the relationship between God and information? God forming data into reason, God informing the world into being, not just an energy transfer moment, but in informing, reforming the world of data, not just in creation, but in God's ongoing creative activity, his sustenance of all that is and will be. God's action in both quantum events and in their outcomes, however random, however creative or destructive, going back to Emily's paper yesterday about the size of evil, but also God's witness as love in all of this, communicating as love in God informing the universe. Christ is the Logos incarnate, God's conversational information fusing with flesh, both fully God and fully human. What would it mean to stick with Nicaea? Rather than say, well, Nicaea is just made up later. What it means to stick with Nicaea is a prescience of our new understanding of science. Just as we were using so many of the church fathers, I hope we get some church mothers sometime as well. We're kind of using so many of them to say, this is what they said, and now look, we see it in information and energy and what have you. Why do you check out the Nicene Creed as well then from that? I wonder what Hildegard of Bingen and Teresa of Norwich would say about all this. There's one. God's cosmic data of love informed in a baby in Bethlehem, in a man spending years with the poor, and in a man crucified. But of course, as God incarnate, love made flesh could not remain dead. The information continued to be present in the cosmic reality of Christ. There is something here too, I'm coming to the end on this, which ties in with the French theologian Jean-Luc Marion's exploration of the way that God gives of God's self. He calls it a gracious openness. A gracious openness to the interface, to the interactivity. An openness to change. Just as God gave his Logos as an interface with the world, so the Bible becomes another interface of gifting himself into the world. Something close to what those who espouse the theological interpretation of Scripture in their understanding of the Bible, being a Christological metaphor. they talk about, with aspects both of divine and human. But Marion, I think, is pushing us even further to a concept of a God who gives God's self in all that God does. God's offering his being into the world through the Trinity, through the Father who is love, through the Son who is Logos, through the Spirit who is life. Indeed, Marion goes on to suggest that the fullness of God's gift is in this overflow of information. The abundance of information is where we encounter the divine. This overflow of being, which makes this interface truly iconic, truly pregnant with the presence of God. And yes, he does go into the icon. The icon is a place of overflow of information. And any other picture that doesn't have an overflow of information is an idol. And I kind of play around in digitality of selfie culture as idolatry. Whereas the kind of orthodox models of icons and what have you become this sense of iconic engagement with the divine, this overflow of information. It's in the abundance of information that we encounter the divine. Anything less is simply an idol. That's what I think digital theology is. That's what I think I've experienced here in the last few days as my brain has burnt hard by thinking so many of these concepts through. As we come back to us, to our engagement with God, to our interface with God's self through digitality and through information, the very information which informs difference, which engineers difference, which powers transformation. Life itself is energy transfer and informational formation. An encounter with the divine who is both energy and information, both light and wisdom. And perhaps it's that encounter which pushes us to discover more about ourselves, our world and our universe. That encounter with a God who is the ground of all being. That encounter with a God who informs difference, engineers difference, powers transformation. And perhaps that encounter pushes us to discover more and more about ourselves, our world and our universe. That encounter which enables theology and science, because metaphysically it is the same. Fundamentally, God becomes the iconic overflow of information into our created world, the abundance of information, the iconic interface. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter. I'm just going to turn the light up a bit. Questions? Andrew.
Thank you for a very stimulating presentation. You asked a question earlier about how information changes, and a possible answer from the Eastern tradition is to say it's not so much the information that's changing, it's the grounding of the information that's changing. So Maximus talks about the Logos becoming thick in different ways. So he becomes thick in the cosmos, he becomes thick in Jesus Christ, and he becomes thick in the words of Scripture. And he doesn't mention a fourth, but he could have done the Logos being thick in the Trinity, in Trinitarian relation. So in each case, there's a different hypostasis, there's a different mode of existence. So by analogy, think the Beethoven Symphony, digital information that's thick on your CD player, it's thick on your vinyl record, it's thick on a tape, different modes of existence. So I wonder if that's a possible way of thinking about it.
Yeah. Yes, it is. And also I chased that up. I intend to go and read Maximus. After uni, your paper and everything, which was wonderful. But it's also linked up with Maris's paper about slow thinking and slow learning, about spiritual intelligence, which you should all watch online because, those of you who weren't there have missed a wonderful paper. But Maris kind of talked about, this ISSR thing he's involved in which they're suggesting that spiritual thinking is kind of this slowness of body, which as soon as you said it here, was about the thickening experience. One of the things I dreaded about this paper, that I'd go really fast through it. So I was constantly kind of saying, hold on a minute, slow down. slow down in what you're doing, slow down in what you're saying, slow down the amount you speak in this, because it's really, really important to do that sense of thickening, that kind of attention to what God's up to in your very words, and I think there's something there, there's about the thickening of the logos in this situation, and of course the thickening of the logos in worship and so on, and in inflection and in the veneration of icons and so on like that. The whole thing, there is that thickening of context, which I think is crucial. Yeah, but it's not about us then, though, is it? It's the thickening of the logos, which is really expensive. Does the thickening of the logos slow us down? Is it that's the thickening? Sorry.
Thank you, Pete. That was great. It really was. I've got two quite different questions, actually. The first one, you mentioned Nicaea.
Yeah.
I'm thinking about Chalcedon.
Yeah.
And prosopon, Museus, in a sense of the substance, and prosopon in the sense of face. Would that be a useful concept? Faces provide identity and information, and the prosopon masks did. So we've got, you talked about the danger of the monad god rather than the triune god. But prosopon seems a helpful concept in that sense.
Mm-hmm.
With the emphasis on the face rather than the separation, the unity rather than separation. Mm-hmm. And the second one is this another Reformation? And how do we avoid burning people?
Wow. Well, a good thing not to burn people is not to go into Chalcedon. So Dodge, I don't know much about Chalcedon. I don't know, I do know the prosopon and Usa stuff and everything, but can I dodge that? I think is this a Reformation? I think it is a Reformation because of what science is doing. The shift to quantum changes everything, and the shift towards information, what have you, that we saw this morning in Michael Bedette's thing and everything. What Lorenzo Floridi is doing, and many others, kind of changes where we are. We need to rethink our understanding of God, not because information. It's not because information has changed, but our perception of information is changing as we kind of come into a greater knowledge ourselves of what is happening. And yes, there may well be a time to put the matches away and to ensure we don't start burning people. But that goes all ways, doesn't it? Because those of us who are hackers have a tendency to burn people, and we've got to stop that. And those of us who are traditionalists have a tradition of burning people. There's a lot of burning in the Reformation on both sides. And so it's a conversation. How do we have these kind of conversations in community? As we've manifested here in this community over the last 3 days. We haven't really been shouting at one another, I don't think. There's been lots of changes in information, changes in conversation going on.
And there's also power and status.
Yeah.
You and I remember great and orderly discussions about communion and remote.
Yep.
And the heat and lack of light at the time.
Mm-hmm.
But that was very much about power and privilege.
Yeah. Always. Matthews.
Thank you very much for the presentation. I had two quick questions. If information is organized data, how do you look at, for example, the idea of Sophia in the Bible, the Old Testament understanding of wisdom? How would that be placed in this context? Secondly, my question is, are we pipelining the whole idea of information into data and numbers? For example, could we hold that in tension with poetic metaphors? Poetry which tries to use analogy, imageries, etc. For example, when the God of life sharing life with humanity is pictured as God feeding breast milk to his children in Syriac poetry, for example. So should we hold this whole framework of data, information, etc. in tension with poetry and metaphors and imageries?
Yeah. So yes. I see you nodding. So I was afraid you're going to go and challenge me about data and information, and I'll leave that to the scientists because I need to know more about that. I need to go and learn so much. But then you chose Sophia, and let's celebrate that. So I think that in the link between Sophia, Logos, Jesus, we see the overflow of information, and the sense that the Proverbs or the Song of Solomon's exploration of Sophia Metaphysics as an emanation of God, as a part of God's character, but also perhaps the thing that's firstborn in all his creation, the firstborn in his ways, who danced before him when he created all things, and so on. The sense that she's an artisan, she's a kind of chief scientist on God's team. Yeah, this amazing. Sorry, I've updated the Hebrew there. But this amazing Greek, the amazing sense that Sophia has always been. Martin Scott's book about Logos as Sophia, or Jesus as Sophia. That as we gradually understand this concept of the cosmic Christ, the role of Christ, the role of the second person Trinity, as wisdom, as information, and so on, perhaps that we need to embrace the Sophia traditions into that, rather than override the Logos with it. Well, because you could go, well, Sophia is an Old Testament concept, and this is what a lot of Johannine scholars do, and that's trumped by the white man Jesus. Yeah, it was actually Arabic Jesus. Yeah, and that in fact we need to say actually the Logos is known through that feminine metaphor, as in Proverbs 9, good wisdom and so on, calling from the housetops and so on. So there's so much of that, but I think this is what I was talking about. We encounter the abundance of information that we encounter the divine. We encounter the divine, the understanding of information, by going back to Sophia and reading what Sophia is about, going back to the ideas of consorts of God, by going back into the whole tradition of Sophia. Sophia is the image that is painted on the cathedral in Kiev. And Sophia is there, pictured as a deacon of the church, servant of the church. But Sophia is this kind of divine aspect, and the keeper of the Santa Sofia Cathedral, I know, Georgia Pavlenko, was there 2 nights after the Russian war started, praying that Saint Sophia would protect Kiev with her holy wall around the city. Okay, what does that mean then now that Kiev was liberated, kind of thing, but perhaps still under danger? What's that mean about Sophia being part and parcel of our constant, of our events happening in the world today? And that sense, it's just huge, and it's the overflow of abundance of information. Sorry, that's far too long an answer.
Thanks, Finn. Peter, you brought up the church during the pandemic at the beginning of your talk, so I want to ask a question about that since you brought it up. And as one of those magic hand priests that got a bit of a knock at the start, I just wanted to ask about something around how we go forward, because I completely agree with you. The church has opened up usefully a can of worms, and suddenly we're able to connect with those who'd been excluded in the past, particularly those who are disabled or unwilling to go to church in any way. And lots of discussion, people always ask the question, well, what is the church? And we all know the correct answer is it's not the buildings, it's the people. But actually, my observation during the pandemic was these buildings were really important to people. I moved to Lichfield, and there was a man who suffers very badly with schizophrenia. And the day they locked down, 23rd of March, he stood in the close and screamed, "Traitor," over and over again, because we'd shut the doors. He'd never been in the building up until that point, but that was an important place for him. And I found on more than one occasion people weeping at the doors. So a question for me is, what's going on there? What spiritual intelligence are, what are people tapping into in our holy places? Situation now is church leaders, we don't know what to do, because we like our buildings. We know what to do in buildings, but we've also got this. How would you advise us, from Centre of Digital Theology, a solution going forward? We've, paying attention to the power and privilege that we have, but also perhaps drawing on some of the metaphysics that you talked about in your talk as well.
Yeah. So I think communion is really, really interesting, and I think I'd like to rewrite a paper kind of writing about communion because of the light of what I've done here with the metaphysics. But my theology about communion has always been very high Catholic, in that I regard every act of communion as being a drawing together of the church militant and triumphant. That it's a moment outside of time and space. You can't have those, but you know what I mean. that at that time we go back to an celebration, where Christ is present, where God is present, and the sense of that we share with all the church, living and dead, and wherever, that we enter the throne room of heaven. Revelations 4 and 5 takes us there, and that the breaking of the bread is thus a moment of conjoining the whole church. That Christ is the one who breaks the bread and shares the wine. That it's not just Little Methodist Chapel in Bowburn celebrating the communion, but actually it's joining with the whole universal church across time and space. Okay, so that kind of, and that's why I will misuse the term quantum entanglement. Do you know what I mean? That's the kind of quantum entanglement moment that we have. So it's actually a very high understanding of it. It's not a utilitarian that this is just bread and this is just wine and we break it and eat it. Which I think is, I won't say who that's model. So first of all, I'm not saying online communion gets rid of the idea of I think it does get rid of the sacred hands, because it doesn't need the sacred hands, because it's God who's breaking, and perhaps those who break are in persona Christi at that point. I think I go back and say, actually, I apologise if it's come across that I'm saying that digital beats physical or digital beats on-site. I'm not trying to say that. What I'm saying is that we need on-site and online together in order to reach more people, to know about the loving embrace of God. And yes, for some people, on-site is going to be the chief way that they engage, and no wonder, because that's the way we've done church for the last 2,000 years, or 1950 years, because the online church has been around for about 50 years. So we need that, but also we need to stop having these wars between on-site and online, and we need to actually say, how do we take the church online in a way that is properly online? Just so we can have properly Catholic expressions of Anglicanism. So how can we have properly online expressions of the church that's natively online, that has its own ideas of symbology and liturgy and engagement and so on, that takes discipleship in a particular direction, what have you. Now that they're going to have kind of layers back to on site, but I want all expressions of the church to flourish. And I apologise that sometimes I get a bit too het up with digital, that I preference digital. But there's a lot more behind that. This whole idea of the Eucharist being this kind of universal, quantum entangled moment I quite like to explore.
Thank you very much. Got any more questions from the floor?
Thank you for a really informative talk. And I was wondering basically if you could talk more on what you was talking about earlier in terms of the church as a technology. If you could elaborate on that more. And even, I was just thinking about if the church is a technology, the Bible is a type of technology, and if you go back into the Old Testament, like let's say the building of altars to God as a form of technology, ways like to mediate your relationship with God. What does that mean for this kind of shift to a digital age? Is it that much of a new thing, basically, or is it just kind of natural to what humans do and have always kind of done? Or we've always used technology to kind of mediate our relationship with God?
Stonehenge. So you think you're dead right, and so I'm New Testament scholar, so that's the area, that's my area, and so my engagement with the Bible is kind of the first place I kind of go to go explore things with. But you're quite right to say actually the church, and I said myself, the church is technology, but does that actually make the church a place of interface? A place of sentient technology, which I think we think it is, isn't it? That actually the church is a place where we interact with the divine, with the Holy Spirit, with God's presence, with Jesus. That in a way, the theatre of the Mass is as important as the architecture of the building, the theatre of what we do there. And so there are plenty of experiences in religion, digital religion, and in religious studies of people being converted simply by watching the Mass, by following the Mass through, without necessarily a level of understanding, especially if it's in Latin or something like that. So in a way, that kind of interface works there as well as with what I'm suggesting in the Bible, that there is this kind of the power of technology in a religious environment. And yeah, take it back, as far as you want to. I'd like to explore that idea a lot more. I think it's a really, really inventive kind of way to look at it. All the time, it's this, but it's going back not necessarily to we've got to wait for the right technology to come along, because it's part of the ongoing engagement of the divine with us, His creation, that it's the sense of God who wants consistently to have a semantic relationship with us, to talk with us, to engage with us. And so perhaps God breaks through the limitations of our technology to connect. And that we're seeing a new kind of breakthrough at the moment with digitality, because it's simply a new technology that's there. Do you know what I mean? And that there will be a new kind of way of doing church for this environment. I don't know whether that will be the metaverse or anything, or VR church, what have you. I think it will be a merging of the two. But you look at, this is where we've not gone in science fiction, really, because science fiction doesn't really have church. Star Trek does take us to religion, but only in the later ones after Roddenberry left. And so we're in a space which we can't really encounter yet. In Altered Carbon, the neo-Catholics object to the eternity of the Mets. They think you should only have 80 years and 10, whatever it is. 80 years and 10, 70, but they allow it to go to 120, I think. But then they reckon you should die naturally rather than be regenerated by the chip going in your neck. So will the church become a kind of anti-information, anti-technology place as we move into the future? And we see some of that happening in the States at the moment. The kind of shift away from technology into a different space. Huge question. Thank you for raising that. Brilliant.
Thank you. We've got time for one final question if anyone's got any. Thank you so much, Pete. I think it's a brilliant way to conclude the conference. Really feels like we've come full circle as well, and that we've come back to where we started on Thursday. Had to briefly think about how many days we've been here. It feels like we've put an awful lot in. But yeah, it really does feel like you've brought us back full circle, particularly looking at Niels's work and that real kind of conversation. And I think what's been really great is that joining between deep questions of metaphysics and also deep, really important questions about data and information use, and actually being able to explore both of these in the same conference. So if you can join me saying thank you to Pete again. So I'm just going to have a few concluding comments. I've just got a few things to say. I know I'm double mic'd. Use handheld, okay. Just a few things to say. Firstly, thank you everyone who has joined us online, everyone who has come in person, and those who have already had to disappear off to catch flights. For me, it's been a really great first conference. Thanks to Gillian for organising the venue in the first place. I think it is a stunning venue, and I think that has made such a difference as well to being back in person. For me, I think I just touched on it there, but the thing that has really struck me about this conference is the sheer diversity of the papers that we have had and the sheer number of perhaps novel conversations that has started. I know there has definitely been a lot of conversation in each of our coffee breaks, and certainly at the pub last night and kind of in any other space people have managed to find. And that's really, really great to see. And, I've got to be honest, I came at this from very much a metaphysics angle. That's my wheelhouse. That's my happy place. But it's just been so great to learn from all of you, from Matthew and Rachel and Beth and the rest of you that have kind of had a more, and Michael, the kind of more information techie space that it's definitely raised a lot of questions for me that I'm certainly going to go away and think about. And really about our church responsibility, or the kind of religious responses and responsibilities, I think, in this space. And then just also to say thank you again to, I've lost him, Andrew Jackson and his Peacock Prize entry, and to everyone else that entered the Peacock Prize. It's just been so wonderful to have had so many entries, but also to have awarded it again for the first time in quite some time, but in person. It feels like it's just really, really made the conference. And I'm just really looking forward to next year. We're having a bit of a conversation about what next year looks like. But it is also the 45th, we think we worked out, anniversary of SRF. So really interesting to see how far the science and religion discourse has come, but also those new and emerging voices that are becoming so much more important, and perhaps picking up on some of those spaces where the diversity hasn't been heard historically. And I think that's definitely where we're keen to look at moving the Science and Religion Forum forward, so it continues to grow and continues to keep abreast of the current debates, not just looking backwards. So with that, I will pass back over to Gillian.
Thank you, Finn. Chairs in the past have said something, meaningful at the end of conferences, drawn it together. I'm not sure you need me to repeat again what's been said in all the wonderful papers. So instead, academic at the moment, I'm largely looking at phenomenology and hermeneutics. And so I decided I wanted to sum up examining the experience of being here as well. And I hope some of it resonates with you. Do you remember where we started? Just a couple of days ago, I reminded us all that the SRF is about bringing science and religion together for, do you remember the quote? For close attention and continuing reassessment. Close attention and continuing reassessment. What happened in this space this time? What data came? What information flowed? What was new? What enraged? What demanded? What happened in this space? Depth, discussion, friendship. It was good to be back together, right? What just happened in this space? Metaspace, metaverse. What phrase will resonate and remain? Deep faking God. The shaming of the theologian. Sarx 1, Sarx 2, Sarx 3, Sarx 4, Sarx 5. The wisdom of God in all its colors. God squeezed thin in space. What idea will you take from this place? Blessed by the algorithm. The algorithm made me do it. What happens in that virtual space, the infosphere, divine sparks of information? The gaps between universes, gap spaces, faith seeking information, between lefty and righty, between material and mind, between us and animals, between intentionality and information, these liminal spaces, blessings, gap spaces, and graces. What happened in the beginning? In the beginning was a word, logos, wisdom, reason, information. God dusted off his clay-encrusted body. What happened in those spaces? What suffering was endured? In all those fracturing universes, splitting, salvation through suffering splintered, the fracturing between the ideal and the real, the pain and the rupture, the source of it all. The heicity of this lectern, this place, this time which cannot be repeated. The algorithm to be ignored, countered, let's revolt. Maximus, Greek for the greatest. In the gap, the telos, in the meantime, being. Well-being, eternal well-being. Self-unity under threat. Let's pay loving attention, close attention. and continuing reassessment. So, thank you for coming. Thank you once again to all the speakers, each and every one. Thank you to the committee, and actually huge personal thanks to Finn. I think Finn needs his own round of applause, actually. Yeah. I get all the glory, but he does almost all the work. And Matt, who's held it all together for us. On your behalf, I'd like to thank the staff of Woodbrook for the hospitality and all their food over the last 3 days. It's my job also to stand here and come up with poetry, but also say if you're not a member, do consider joining. We're really friendly, as you now discovered, and we'll be back with another great conference next year. Have a safe trip home, and see you all next year.